do that. Yeah, shall we start?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. So welcome everyone. It's very good to see you. First of all, we have moved the seminar to a new and more secure platform here, and we're really delighted to welcome you to the second seminar in the series on the Transnational Colloquium, Reflections on Borders in the Time of COVID-19. The series is organized by myself and by Moritz Mihatz from the British University in Cairo. And it was Moritz who took the initiative to the series and has really done a tremendous amount of work to bring this together. The basic idea of the seminars is that the time of COVID-19 offers a moment to reflect on issues concerning borders, sovereignty, the flow and non-flow of ideas and people in historical and contemporary contexts. There's also a moment where, of course, it's important to continue our academic exchanges across borders while most of us are still under some form of lockdown. Today was actually the first day back at uni in Denmark here, and hopefully a sign that things also will begin to become more normal elsewhere, or at least whatever the new normal might be. So 2 weeks ago we had Paul Nugent give a really interesting and informative talk about the situation in different parts of Africa, providing both a historical and a political context to the things that are happening around borders in different regions of the continent. And today our transnational discussion will revolve around a different geographical space, namely Russia. And we are delighted to have Professor Brian Boeck with us today here, who's a leading expert on boundaries and borders in Russian history. Professor Boeck is based at DePaul College of Liberal Arts in Chicago, where he teaches Russian history and global history. He has a PhD from Harvard and has published extensively on questions of empire and borderland, including one book that I would highly recommend, Imperial Boundaries, Cossack Communities and Empire Building in the Age of Peter the Great. And this book analyzes transformations of Cossack communities in response to Muscovite imperial expansion in the 18th century. And I think in the context of this seminar, I at least would like to highlight that this book really analyzes the complex sort of border dynamics in informed ways that emphasizes also agency in the margins of empire or imperial census. And we're delighted that Professor Boeck has accepted our invitation. And the title of his talk today is From Imperial Boundaries to Iron Curtains, Russia's Contribution to Global Boundary Maintenance. So Brian will be speaking for maybe 30 minutes or so, and after that we will have a Q&A session, which Moritz will be leading. So that's sort of the plan for how we will do this. So the floor is yours, Brian, and yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Casper and Moritz, for the invitation. I'm quite delighted to be able to talk about my work. It's been about 11 years now since I published Imperial Boundaries, so it's an opportunity to revisit something that was very dear to me and look at it in a broader context. The basic point that I'm going to be putting forth today is that Russia has one of the longest and most fascinating histories of boundary maintenance in the world, and that certain innovations in borders and boundaries as tools of statecraft did not originate with the nation state, did not originate in Western Europe, but in fact came from the Russian parts of Eurasia. The thing that always strikes me when I pick up a textbook on our world history is that there is either no discussion of borders altogether or the assumption that borders have always existed, and borders imagined as existing as we see them in the 20th century. And so you can pick up a survey of Soviet history in which the fact that the Soviet Union is the first state to achieve operational effective control over its borders is never mentioned. The issue of the Iron Curtain in its various forms, never discussed, never portrayed, never depicted. It's sort of something that doesn't get discussed very much. And so in this talk, I want to discuss something that's overlooked in virtually all narratives of global history, and that is the emergence of hard borders, the emergence of complicated, multi-layered boundary maintenance infrastructures, and trace their emergence in Russia from the 17th century into the 20th century. And I think that the Russian case study has a number of things to recommend it, and there are similarities with other global case studies. So for quite a number of years, I taught a survey of comparative borders in world history, and one could see, let's say, aspects of Hadrian's Wall and aspects of China's inter-Asian border experience playing themselves out in Russia in the 17th century. And at the same time, it's part of an emerging European system. So what I wanted to do with my work, when I wrote this book, which came out of a dissertation, I was really pushing back against the narrative that the story of global borders begins with the Peace of Westphalia, which never mentions borders for some reason, and interstate negotiation and diplomacy. I saw it rather as emerging with practical problem solving in different parts of the world in different ways at different times. So when I used to teach that seminar on borders, I would start with Hadrian's Wall, I would then go to China, then I would go to Inter-Asia, then I would go to Russia, and only after that would the class visit Europe. So I'll mention some of those things today. And Russia is the first interesting case, well-documented, interesting case of dual functionality of boundary infrastructures. So the same barriers that were originally designed to keep the outsiders out, nomadic raiders who would raid into the heart of Muscovy, depleting its population. The same boundary maintenance infrastructures that were used at first to keep the outsiders out are then deployed to keep the insiders in. And I think dual functionality is something that always needs to be taken into consideration when dealing with border infrastructures. The last point, I'll make 2 points towards the end. One, that the Czarist legacy of migration control and border patrol shaped the Soviet experience in ways that are not acknowledged, and via the Soviet experience, the rest of the world. And then, time permitting, or if the spirit moves me, something about the second serfdom, the possibility of modern technology as a way of controlling, limiting, stopping the flow of goods, peoples, and ideas. So I'll perhaps touch on that at the end. Casper mentioned my book, so I won't say much about it. My book was written in dialogue with Peter Solons's book Boundaries, which traced the history of the border between France and Spain in the Cerdaña region, which came out in 1989. I found that many of the things that he was saying about the development of the French and Spanish borders simply did not apply to the area that I was studying. And so as I was studying Russian empire building, Russia's southern frontier, the evolution of the Russian Ottoman border in the late 17th and early 18th century, what I saw was an empire that's innovating in using borders as a tool of statecraft. Now, we've been taught to believe that it's the nation state that innovates, the empires are somehow backwards or backwards looking. And what I found was an empire that created borders, instituted identity checks, deported dissidents, instituted documenting of an additional identity, asserted claims of control over all individual movement in and out of its territory. So something that precedes, in some cases by centuries, the territorialization of the state that we see in Western Europe. And so as I was writing my book, I looked at some of those issues. I won't get into all of them today simply because you can read it. I want to take a much wider view. So when looking at the normal historiography on borders, that there's usually a kind of Western European bias. It all started with the Peace of Westphalia and patterns of diplomacy and international cooperation. And I think the Russian case was very different because the Russian Empire is unilaterally introducing separation between its territory and non-state space, state not controlled by any neighboring political entity. A second differing factor that was quite important was the emergence of serfdom, the Tsar's extreme claim to control over individuals, and the origins of serfdom as a restriction on movement. That is, serfdom originally was the proposition that you are bound to the land and cannot leave, and policing those restrictions on movement become part of boundary maintenance in the story of Russia's 17th century. The story of state sovereignty obviously looks very different under autocracy than it does under other political systems. But I was looking to tell a story of difference. So when Solons argued that the boundary between France and Spain gradually emerged between 1659 and 1868, and it took a long time for ecclesiastical, fiscal, seigneurial, local, and royal jurisdictions to start to coincide. Those things did not coincide with state borders. He talks about a very long, drawn-out story, and what I find happening in the Russian context of the 17th century is the various processes that take the better part of 200 years to unfold in the Serdanya. I see evidence of those same processes unfolding along the Russian southern frontier in the space of about 2 decades. And I'll give a couple of examples of that in just a few minutes. Like Solons, I see a lot of local active participation in the maintenance of boundaries, locals who invest in boundary maintenance infrastructures because it serves their interests at a given time for a given reason. And so my Cossacks were both facilitators of imperial boundaries and victims of imperial boundaries, and I talk about that quite a lot in the book. That is, some Cossacks find that it's in their interest to become border guards and bodyguards and mounted patrolmen. Others find that it's in their interest to flee from Russian territory into the Caucasus Mountains. So you get a mix of reactions there. If we mapped out a kind of general story of borders in Europe's 18th century, we get a rough contours that look like this in the 16th to 18th century, maps becoming essential for delineation of boundaries, rulers beginning to define the limits of their territory with more and more precision, bilateral treaties, agreements, etc. Again, the Russian case complicates all this, and I'll take a couple of minutes to talk about why I think that's the case. If you look at the case that Solons talks about, you have all sorts of things unfolding at different times. The discussion of borders in the 1650s, the delineation of borders in the 1660s, the actual active demarcation being completely delayed until the 19th century, the beginning of active patrol only in the late 19th century, surveillance of merchants in the 18th century, military surveillance in the 1660s, disease surveillance probably even earlier than that, surveillance of ordinary people only in the 1820s. And Solons, in his book, it's a great book, but he never actually establishes, he never actually establishes that France had operational or effective control over its boundaries. And so again, is boundary maintenance about claims of control, or is boundary maintenance about effective control? And I think we would have different narratives depending on how we frame the question of control. And so in the Russian context, I want to deal with this control issue a bit, keeping in mind that no state until the middle of the 20th century had full effective operational control over its borders. That is, if we're saying in the Eurasian space, at what point did Russia have full operational control of its borders, the capacity to apprehend every single individual who tried to cross the border illegally, the ability to apprehend 90% of the flow, to surveil or apprehend 90% of the flow of goods across the border, that control only comes in the mid-20th century. So control is an important part of this, but in my work, I think it's the claim of control that's important. So when a state that has very few resources is still asserting claims of control, still saying, in spite of limitations and constraints on governing, it's going to attempt to control every entry and exit from its territory. That's a pretty important claim. And I think this goes against kind of our standard understanding of borders. First, there's delineation, and then there's demarcation. Well, the idea of control has to emerge in some kind of deliberation, in some kind of discussion. It has to appear in someone's mind as a problem before all these other things happen. And I think in the Russian case, the idea of people moving as a problem emerges in the 17th century in connection with the policing of serfdom. How do you keep serfs on the land? You stop them from moving. You police their migration. Particularly on the southern frontier, how do you keep serfs from claiming free land just outside the Tsar's grasp, just beyond the Tsar's reach? You create boundary maintenance infrastructures. And so I talk a lot about that in the book. I'll say only a little bit about that today. So claims of control, active assertion of control, operational control, we could create different timelines based on these different models. And living as we are in the time of COVID, the first attempts that the Muscovite state makes to actually assert claims of control along its borders almost always have to do with plagues. That is, even though the Tsar has very limited resources at his disposal, whenever there's a report of plague along the southern frontier, they attempt to set up something resembling a cordon sanitaire. That is, they put patrols on all the main roads. They issue instructions to those patrols to stop every traveler. So in the earliest attempts at control, and I think this holds up quite well for Western Europe as well, tend to be policing epidemics or trying to stop the spread of infectious diseases. There were all sorts of measures. In the 17th century, they didn't have a sense of quarantine yet, but they did have a sense of not letting individuals who showed visible symptoms of disease or who had traveled to places where there were rumors of disease, they were simply not allowed to pass and kept in place. And all sorts of measures were in place for burning their personal possessions or purifying them. If they were carrying messages, the message would be rewritten twice before being sent to Moscow. So there were all sorts of measures about policing disease. And I want to quote a document from 1625 along the southern frontier. So Voronezh, a town called Voronezh, a governor who has maybe a few hundred troops at his disposal gets the following instructions. You are ordered to set up strong checkpoints in the direction of the Don region so that no one can by any means ride or walk through around your checkpoints into the steppe towns and districts so that they do not introduce the plague from Don. And so this idea of trying to control, trying to assert total control of all movement, the idea emerges well before the capacity. The idea that this is necessary, possible, emerges before the capacity. They will try in 1670, as a result of the Rosenbellion, to completely seal off the southern border. I would say their attempts were probably 50% successful. Goods and people still made it through, but it's an attempt to seal off the boundaries of the state from a different kind of plague, that is the plague of rebellion, the plague of dissent, the plague of uprising. And so they make a second attempt to seal off the border of the Don region around 1670. And again, I think it's not whether they succeeded or failed that's important. It's about asserting a policy of screening every traveler, asserting a policy of recording every entry and exit, asserting a policy of each traveler having to have a piece of paper that legitimates his or her movement. I see these policies anticipating many things that we'll see happening in Western Europe a century later or more than a century later. And I'll give an example from that period. So what we see in the 1670s is not only an attempt to assert control, but actual patrolling habits that try to ensure that multi-layered boundary maintenance is happening. And so what do I mean by multi-layered systems of boundary maintenance? If you are trying to go to the Don region, in order to get a travel document, you have to have surety. That is, there have to be several people in your village who will vouch for you, stand before a government official, put their stamp on a piece of paper and say, I will be responsible if this person does not come back. So there's control even before you depart. You stand in front of an official when you ask for a travel document, and you have to bring surety. So there are records of who has asked for permission, who is traveling where, for how long. that are already being kept from the 1670s. Now, again, this is to make sure that populations don't mix, that people come back, that the Tsar is not losing subjects. One of the things that they're worried about in 17th century Russia is human resources are scarce and precious, and they don't want resources flowing away from the Tsar's control. They don't want Tsar, they don't want peasants, they don't want serfs liberating themselves by means of migration. And so essentially they're already policing all migration along the southern frontier at that point. There is 3 layers of border patrol. Is it a border if it's delineated unilaterally? My answer would be yes, if they're trying to patrol it and control it. Yes, if it's the outer line of sovereignty being exerted by a state. Some have said, well, if you don't have 2 diplomats from 2 governments negotiating it, it's not a border. I see borders as a product of boundary maintenance rather than necessarily involving 2 states sitting down at the bargaining table, but we can talk about that in just a few minutes. So what we see are a series of decrees that try to police migration, in which you have not only checkpoints along the roads that are responsible for stopping every traveler, mobile patrols along the rivers responsible for inspecting boats, but a second kind of third layer of patrols which are spontaneous and always changing. So the problem with patrols on the roads is everybody knows where they are and can just go around them. And so there's a spontaneous mobile kind of border patrol that's also going on for those who get around the checkpoints. And so what we're seeing emerging along what was originally a system of barriers and fortifications to impede nomadic raids into Russia start to be used as boundaries of territorial sovereignty. So my argument is that by 1671, Russian authorities have implemented a boundary regime that is in many ways as rigorous and more rigorous than boundaries between separate states anywhere before the 19th century. This has to do with states claiming the right, claiming the authority to legitimate movement across their borders and jurisdictions, and multi-layered attempts to assert that state control. So if it was just one layer, it would perhaps not be as interesting and compelling, but the fact that an individual who has escaped to the Don region in the late 17th century has evaded no less than 4 layers of control. The first layer of control is people watching him in his home village, reporting to the government the minute he's going illegally. Second layer of control, those government officials who are granting, legitimating travel documents or not. Third layer of control, the actual checkpoints along the border. Fourth layer of control, mobile patrols behind the border, looking for individuals who may have escaped. So it's quite sophisticated, but it's limited. So they're not doing this everywhere. They're doing this in problematic areas. So this I see is quite important. We have a couple of records from the point of view of both the migrants and the border guards. I mentioned those both in the book and in an article. You can look those up if you're interested. I want to move on and talk about what happens during later centuries. Moving to the 18th century, the system that's put in place on the southern frontier tends to also be used along the western frontier, particularly the Russian boundary with Poland. And there have been some good studies lately. There's a scholar named Oksana Meched who completed a dissertation at Harvard a couple of years ago and has published some interesting articles, including one on public health, the role of quarantines along the border. And so again, getting away from that diplomacy is everything point of view, you will have a hard, you could open book after book after book after book and never come across what was probably the single most important fact taken into account by Catherine the Great when she's contemplating the partitions of Poland, and that is that 150,000 Russian serfs self-liberated by migrating to Polish lands, that over 150,000 Russians released themselves from the Tsar's control and migrated to a neighboring country. And this is one of the several complex factors leading Russia to both take over parts of Poland and then construct and control a border in that part of the world. Now, is it a sophisticated border? Not in 20th century terms, but in 18th century terms, it certainly is. Let's say a patrol density of 1 soldier per 4 kilometers of territory, the beginnings of infrastructures, so the beginnings of channeling barriers that keep people from moving through the forests surreptitiously, channeling them towards roads where soldiers and patrols are present. So it's the beginning of a more complicated system. And if I had infinite time, I would talk about that system in more detail. The beginning of a system involving both stationary checkpoints and mobile patrols, and one that contrary to what I saw in the Don region, starts to include urban areas as well. That is, ways of policing larger or middle-sized towns that are adjacent to a border, which involves intelligence and surveillance as much as it does actually involving men on the ground or boots on the ground, and using documents, documenting individual identity, authentication of documents as a way of enforcing all that. So the 18th century brings about some quite interesting innovations. I want to move forward in time to the imperial period. Obviously, Russia has one of the longest land borders in the world, and the resources that are deployed are uneven. That is, in certain parts of Eurasia, they use living fences in the form of Cossack settlements, Cossack fortifications that are used to enforce separation between native populations and Russian imperial populations. And these living fences, these living boundary infrastructures are deployed both in the Caucasus and in parts of Siberia. At the same time, they are creating in the let's say in the West and in the Caucasus boundary infrastructures that look very much like modern border patrols, that look very much in terms of professionalization, use of technology, scientific rationalization. I would say that Russia was well in advance of other countries in sort of creating a kind of scientific border patrol ethos in the late imperial era. So they have a very long border, 20,000 plus kilometers, but by the late imperial years, they have nearly 36,000 dedicated border guards patrolling that territory, most of them deployed in areas where there are no natural barriers, so where there are not mountains, where there are not swamps, there are not deep forests, areas where settlement is thick and connections to foreign populations are long established. So we could look at a variegated picture in the late imperial period. If we're talking about, let's say, somewhere in Central Asia, in the middle of a mountain range, there might be 1 border guard per 50 kilometers. However, if we're talking about the Caucasus, where you have local populations divided by imperial boundaries, there might be 3 border guards per kilometer. If we're talking about the boundaries with Prussia, where there is important ideological control, they're not only worried about the movement of people, but they're worried about keeping out dangerous ideas. Along the border with Prussia, you have 8 patrolmen per kilometer. So we're talking about an emerging, rationalized, scientific system of border patrol in the late imperial era. And the early Soviet experience simply picks up on that late imperial experience. We might say that Soviet border guards in the 1920s are still looking at books produced by Russian imperial theorists of the 1880s and 1890s and applying modern principles or modern technology to what those theorists were talking about in the 1890s and 1880s. Now I want to talk about the Soviet example. I'll take a little bit of time just to develop that. I assume I have about 5-7 minutes.
Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. And so the coming of the Iron Curtain, I think we could look at it in two ways. We can look at it in terms of Russia's imperial boundary maintenance legacy, which is inherited by the Soviet leadership when it comes to power. And at the same time, the legacy of World War I and the series of wars that are fought just before that. That is, applying military technologies to boundary maintenance. And so almost everything that we see in the Iron Curtain as it develops in the second half of the 20th century has its precedent in late 19th or turn of the century warfare. And I'll give a couple of examples of that in just a few minutes. The Soviets are able to create a very large border force by the 1920s. That is, they're able to staff different problematic areas of the border with men, depending on their perception of the problem. And the patrol densities are almost exactly the same as the imperial era. That is, that they're confronting the same problem that imperial administrators were in terms of populations that are separated by borders and have cross-border ties. So there's a lot of continuity there. The patrol densities are almost the same. What's new are the attempts to restrain all outward movement. And so in the 1920s, movement outside of the Soviet Union is still possible. They're arresting something in the neighborhood of 40, 50,000 people a year for quote unquote border violations. 3/4 to 80% of those are people trying to leave the Soviet Union. And the tendency is through creating a multi-layered system of boundary maintenance to bring that number down. And they're clearly achieving that both by raising the number of border guards, raising the amount of surveillance that's done in the districts adjacent to the border. That is, the most effective way to stop someone from crossing the border is to keep them away from the border in the first place, to keep them miles away rather than meters away. And so they start doing that. They purge the border areas of unreliable elements, which means they're moving any individual who might be able to smuggle or might have cross-border connections or might have divided political loyalties, literally relocating those people away from the border in order to quote unquote protect the border. And they're starting to implement technology. I say starting because we imagine that the Stalinist system is a kind of highly efficient, technologically equipped system. But from the point of view of the border, it's still rather poorly equipped in terms of infrastructure. Not totally, I guess I would say they're patrolling a 20th century border with 18th century technology. Men on horseback, and they're still using felled trees as boundary infrastructures. I would say that the Soviet border of the 1920s would look very familiar to an imperial border guard from the 18th century. By a decade later, everything is starting to change. And this mechanization, introducing radio communication, creating border strips, so areas along the border that have been cleared of all vegetation, all settlement, all inhabitation, so that border guards have clear sight lines, sprinkling those areas or plowing those areas so that you can track for meters and meters and meters anyone who is attempting to cross the border. So they're creating an engineered border, a border in which human intervention by the 1930s is very, very stark, and increasingly a border that's equipped with modern infrastructure such as barbed wire, infrastructure such as electrified barriers, and electric fencing, first used during the Russo-Japanese War by the Russians to protect the town of Port Arthur. They're increasingly thinking in terms of border infrastructure, and I would emphasize the engineering thinking is already thinking ahead to the Iron Curtain by the mid-20s. The capacity to actually build it and invest in it is not there yet. So when you look at Russian scientific border maintenance as it's conceptualized in the Soviet Union in the mid-20s, they're looking back to what worked during World War I. They're looking back at the death strips created by the Germans in Belgium. They're looking back towards the Anglo-Boer War. So they're basically looking at the range of recent histories and the ways that you stop movement and thinking about how to apply that to boundary maintenance. And so they didn't quite by the coming of World War II have all of that in place, but they're certainly experimenting. They're certainly experimenting with modern, technologically equipped borders, and as well with, experimenting with barriers. It's only fully implemented in the late 1940s, in which they incorporate an even larger exclusion zone. So the exclusion zone from which all inhabitants must be removed becomes 800 meters from the actual border. They move thousands of people, and they string literally hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of barbed wire. So when we're talking about the Iron Curtain, right after World War II, they've managed to build hundreds of kilometers of barbed barriers, hundreds of kilometers of either electronic signaling wires or electronic trip wires. They've managed to reduce, how should we put it, by the late 40s, they're probably 80% successful in policing all movement. And that trend continues into the 50s and 60s. Obviously, those lessons are applied in the Berlin Wall. And because of technology, they're actually able to reduce their border guard force by half. They're able to use technology instead of people. So this, in a nutshell, is the story from the earliest infrastructures to the Iron Curtain. And I'd be willing to provide more nuance, more explanation, anything that I couldn't mention in the interest of time. I'd be willing to say more about it or answer any questions.
All right, thank you very, very much. That was extremely interesting. So in technical terms, what I would like to do, if the people who could want to ask a question would just tell me that they want to ask a question in the function which says question, and then I'm going to unmute you. And then after you ask your question, do me a favor and just mute yourself. And then, you know, like, so I don't need to like keep track of everybody who's muted or unmuted. So if you do have a question, just send me a, exactly. So we have Ola Uduku, and I'm just going to find you here and unmute Ola. So Ola, please.
Don't hear anything.
I don't think we can hear you. No? I think there might be a technical issue. Maybe you can write your question as a, in that case, as a question in the question box, and instead I will read it for you. In that case, if I may ask a quick question. So at what point, so you're describing how there is a difference between people being stopped, but at what point in time are we actually also looking at systematic control of goods, and at what point in time is there an imposition of things like customs and stuff like that? Like, when is the border being commercialized?
So in the area I look at it, all of that comes simultaneously. So the only thing that we don't have is delineation, because there really are, there's no necessity of maps when there's not a foreign adversary contesting the territory. But essentially, by the 1670s, the Russians are asserting along the southern frontier the right to inspect every traveler, assess customs duties on every object being brought into the state. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't smuggling, but they're asserting the right to stop and inspect every traveler. They're asserting the right to assess excise taxes on every good being brought in or outside the state. And they're trying to record the entry and exit of every traveler already by the 1670s. And in terms of customs duties, they already by the 17th century, they have a fairly elaborate system for that.
Okay, and what range of customs are we looking at? I mean, is it relatively high or still relatively low, what they're charging for goods?
I'll have to evade that one, but simply because in my area the Cossacks had a number of privileges. So the documents that I looked at tended to only be interested in cases in which they were violating their privileges, so I couldn't give a good picture of that. One of the parts of their special deal for defending the area in advance of the Russian boundaries is that they could import and export things without customs duties, so that they have a special arrangement.
All right, then let me read the question from Ola Uduku, who writes, the question is whether the border regimes in Russia are influenced in any way by trading networks elsewhere, such as the Silk Road in China. Also, in the Islamic world, many towns would have walls which excluded travelers and others who might be traders, etc. Would you classify these as human borders? I'm thinking of the Islamic empires.
Yeah, so obviously those structures had existed before at the city level, on the local level. Here we're talking about attempting to do all this in the open steppe. That is, areas where even where there is no settlement, asserting some kind of claim of control. So it's fairly, I would say, fairly sui generis, emerging from local problem solving. At the same time, I will say that the Russian system of policing movement probably has some kind of Mongol antecedents, and probably has some kind of complex, deeper antecedents. So the fact that safe conducts for diplomats, that's certainly an accepted part of the Russian practice, as well as travel permits, that may have originated during the time of the Mongols. It's extremely difficult to document, but that may be something that comes from the outside. But in my view, most of this emerges sui generis from trying to assert the Tsar's rights of control over his subjects. I don't see much of it coming from the outside, although outside forces are certainly something from the point of view of defense and from the point of view of espionage, something that they're interested in. So travelers will also be interrogated to make sure that they are not spies traveling in disguise, or they're only pretending to be merchants in order to inspect the fortifications. So there's always some fear of those coming into the state and some attempt to use the boundary infrastructures to surveil them or detect their true purpose. So every traveler arriving at the Russian border is usually detained for inspection and asked a series of questions, and then the local governor determines if that person gets to travel on. That doesn't quite answer the question, but I simply don't see a lot of influence from outside here.
All right, who else has a question? I mean, I still have, but yeah, Casper, please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much, Brian, for this really interesting talk. So I was touching a bit on the answer that you just gave, but I was just intrigued by this sort of that it seems that in many cases the aspiration to control comes before the actual ability to do it. The aspiration to have a scientific technological infrastructure comes before that. That, of course, sort of for me, that I would be curious to know about. So that would mean that you would be interested in some knowledge to develop that capacity. To what extent was that knowledge during different periods gained from outside, and to what extent were sort of the various techniques and both administrative and also sort of hardware technologically, how did it move in different regions both within and outside? I think this, yeah.
So obviously in the Russian case, Peter I, usually known as Peter the Great, is all important in terms of shifting the administrative gaze towards European practices. And so we can say after the first decade of the 18th century, Russia is fully in dialogue with Europe in these matters, which is what makes the 17th century even more interesting. The fact that they're largely doing this based upon their own understanding and own resources rather than necessarily in dialogue with Europe. I think there's a kind of backdoor to European influence in the Baltic region because they are involved in joint in policing joint boundary regimes with Sweden. They learn a lot of things through that experience. So there is a European influence that comes in a little bit earlier that can be detected, but in general, in the area I study, it's simply local problem solving. You introduce serfdom so that everybody stays in place, because every army servitor needs the resources of 300 serfs to be able to equip himself for battle. But at the same time, you don't have the resources to police the majority of the population. And so you turn to things such as self-policing, so that there are eyes and ears even when there's not a government agent. So they find all sorts of creative solutions to problems of administration in this very vast territory. With the Belgorod line, again, the kind of interesting question is they build a wooden and earthen barrier infrastructure to stop nomadic movement. So they literally put large logs, Lincoln log style, together into sort of X's, and then accumulate earth in front of them to create a barrier against nomadic movement. There's no evidence that they had any knowledge in their tradition of the Chinese experience in doing that, or the Roman experience in doing that. There's no trace in any Russian text that suggests that anything from outside stimulated it. I think it's just when you're confronted with 10,000 nomadic cavalrymen as the problem, the barrier becomes a solution to slow them down, to give your resources time. So that's to kind of go back to that previous question. They come up with similar solutions because they're facing similar problems. Now, Casper, did that quite answer your question?
Yes, it did. Yeah, thank you.
All right, we have one question from our speaker from 2 weeks ago, which is Paul Nugent. Let me unmute Paul. Paul, you should be unmuted.
No?
No.
Oh, why does that not work? It says Paul connect to audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yeah.
We can. Perfect.
Yeah, it's the microphone at the top left of the screen. You have to click.
Oh, okay.
Great. I mean, that was fascinating. I was really glad I've tuned into this one. The question I have is related to information flows. So given the distance of many of these border regions from the center, given the relative slowness of communications, certainly in the 17th century, how on earth did they actually manage the border? I mean, presume that a lot of this is people on the spot making it up as they go along, anticipating what the center thinks they want to do. Whereas in the archive, maybe what has survived is the physical bits of paper telling you what you should be doing. Could you talk a little bit about the information flows?
That's a great question, particularly because we're talking about a vast territory. So when we're talking about parts of Siberia, it could take the better part of half a year to get a message there and half a year to get a message back. And therefore, the Tsar has to informally cede decision-making authority without ceding it. And so my flippant answer to the question is you get long lists of instructions that include a lot of if, then, if, then, if, then. So they give room for operational decision-making at the local level within constraints specified by the center. So if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. So they provide for all sorts of situations. And I guess they never say, if you're confronted with something that's not on the list, decide for yourself. But it's kind of understood that that's what happens. So the local governors are usually given a whole series of responsibilities, and they're responsible for signing off on a list of instructions, and then they implement them themselves. So the possibility for communication with the center during this period is almost impossible. And I would say most of the orders, I think this is true for Russia, in the 20th century as well as in the 17th century, the orders you're getting from the center are unfulfillable with the resources at hand, and therefore you do your best. That's sort of, there are never enough human resources to confront the challenge in Russia. And so there's always a degree of local autonomy within constraint and within well-known, understood by all constraints.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. In that case, if there is no other question at the moment, I'm going to throw one more in. So you ended with the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. Now, what has happened in terms of the borders between what then becomes Russia and becomes the independent, states which were before Soviet republics? What like between, I don't know, Russia and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on? Are these borders similar to the Iron Curtain, or what happens there? If you can say something about that.
Yeah, so I guess there's a question of inherited infrastructures. So let's say where the Soviets had a Iron Curtain-like infrastructure, what happened to it, as well as what did they do with what used to be borders between Soviet republics and now are the borders between sovereign states. There are all sorts of kind of strange events and anomalies that we could talk about at great length here. So there was a time in the 1990s where Russian troops were actually in Tajikistan, patrolling the old Soviet border in Tajikistan at the request of the Tajik government. So there are many strange things like that. Essentially, the 90s saw a wave of dismantling these infrastructures. So let's say the Ukraine-Slovakia border, you saw a lot of dismantling of the barbed wire, the cutting of the fences. And then with the coming of Schengen and the EU, you started seeing them coming back. So the Russia-Latvian border, the Ukrainian-Slovakian border started to look more like these old borders. So we could probably also trace kind of different moments in that post-Soviet story. Russia is building infrastructures, more modern infrastructures of this kind, particularly in the Far East, where they have some concerns about smuggling and migration and the capacity to, I'm looking for the words carefully, absorb and control migrants from both North Korea and China in very sparsely settled areas. So the story continues. It certainly doesn't get a lot of play, but the story continues. And I would say it has various regional permutations.
Yeah, I think there's one person who basically wanted to ask the same question as me, but maybe she has a follow-up question. Nesma, did my question cover what you were going to ask, or do you have a follow-up question to that? I've unmuted you, so if you want to speak, you have to press the microphone icon at the top of the window.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you for the seminar and for your speech. I just have a question regarding the Russian borders. How Russia controls its borders after the collapse of the USSR?
So again, where Russia inherited the old Soviet borders, they tended to continue doing things much as they had before. Where Russia had no border, it depended on really the political relations. So let's say that the long border with Kazakhstan was very porous and almost no infrastructure and remains that way. Ukraine was very porous for a long time. Now you're starting to see infrastructure. So it really depends on, we could probably talk about different parts of the former Soviet Union having different regimes. So let's say the former Soviet republics which have joined the EU, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all share common borders with Russia, and they tend to be the ones that are infrastructuralizing those borders rather than the Russians. So the Latvians have bought a lot of barbed wire lately to put up on their Russian border, most of it financed by the EU. So there are different directions here. And obviously if we move to the Caucasus, the situation there really depends on whether the relations with the country on the other side are friendly or not friendly. And so we'd probably have to talk about 20 different possible ways of approaching the border solutions in the post-Soviet world.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Paul, you have a follow-up question or a different question.
Yes, it's actually a different question. That it's in danger of becoming some name my border kind of exercise. But I'm very struck today by the nature of the Finnish-Russian border. It's been completely depopulated. And I'm wondering what that border would have looked like, you know, take it back 150 years ago. Would we have been talking about areas that had populations that were relatively intermingled, where there was a lot of commerce going on? Is this a recent border effect, or does it have a longer history to it?
I think in that part of the world there wasn't a lot of density of settlement to begin with, and the peculiar history of Russian-Finnish relations, the fact that parts of Finland were taken over as a result of the Soviet-Finnish War, so all of Karelia went into Soviet hands, made that a particularly sensitive area. But someone could write a very intriguing, compelling book about the what's now the Russian-Finnish border, because in the past that was the Russian-Swedish border. You could really take that border over about 3 centuries and do something spectacular with it. And there are wonderful cases during World War I where, because Russia is fighting Germany, these small border towns along the Finnish-Swedish border today all of a sudden become boom towns, because it's the only place where you can exchange both marks and rubles, or things can flow from one zone to another. So there's a bigger story there. But that area was always that how should we put it? The boundary maintenance by mutual agreement has a long history in that area, and so probably the first, even before Moscow was rising, there were border agreements between individual Russian cities and their neighbors across the dividing line. So one could do something very interesting with that. I'll say this as well: the Mannerheim line, which was a military boundary, taught the Soviets a lot as well, and so they really started investing huge amounts of money in barbed wire when they saw what those infrastructures could do in a military context. I just wanted to say one other thing, that the interesting thing during the Great Migration Wave of 2015 was how many people crossed the Russian-Norwegian border on foot and on bicycles, the way they'd managed to make their way to the most remote northern Arctic crossing points as a kind of alternate backdoor. It was quite remarkable. There were all sorts of scams in the Russian news about individuals who were setting up fake border points and charging 5,000 to take people across the border. So there was a quite an interesting development in these remote areas of the Russian far north.
Great, thanks a lot.
If I may ask one more question about this, your 17th century border. I mean, so you compare it a little bit to China, but like in the Chinese case, like with the building of the Great Wall and so on, there is this interesting situation where you have a border towards the Mongols, but at the same time, of course, the Chinese as an empire still have, at least ideologically speaking, they claim sovereignty over everybody, right? I mean, they don't control everything, but at least conceptually, the emperor is above everything. What is that situation in Russia? I mean, do they say, here is our boundary and what is outside, we have no claims towards at all? Or is there an ideological claim to these territories anyway?
That's interesting. So I could answer that on different levels. They make very clear that behind this line are the Tsar's towns, and in front of this line are areas that are either not under the Tsar's control or under the control of the Tsar's clients, the Cossacks. So that delineation is very stark. And the Russian towns versus the steppe towns is a very stark delineation. The Muscovite Empire doesn't quite have as much universalistic aspiration in that sense. And those territories were, all of Russia was still claimed by the Crimean Khanate until the late 18th century. And so this complicated nature of they pretend to claim us, we pay them to relinquish their claims, the lands in between is kind of no man's land. Let's say there are all sorts of diplomatic fictions that get them around this problem of universalistic rules. So they still pay. Nobody talks about this in narratives of Russian history. In the 17th century, they still pay honorable gifts to the Crimean Khanate as a kind of relic of the period of Mongol rule. The Crimean Khanate still claims sovereignty over Russia as a result of the Chinggisid heritage, but in diplomatic meetings, both agree to disagree about that. And so there's a kind of complex issue there. Obviously, there's a sort of long process of repudiation, but one could credibly make the claim that Russia's fully and decisively and finally emancipated from Mongol control when the Crimean Khanate is wiped off the face of the map. Until then, there's still some plausible deniability or old claims that still get asserted. Obviously, by the mid-17th century, they're capable, because of those boundary infrastructures, of preventing nomadic raids, and so they flip the balance of power with the steppe. But from the point of view of the Crimean Khanate, most of those territories north of the Black Sea still belong to them, and that eventually the Russians will recognize it.
Thank you very much. Casper, do you have another question?
So I would, maybe it's a bit sort of a follow-up perhaps from the first question I had, but I was interested in this when the establishment of the 36,000 guard or border officers were established. To what extent could you say a bit about the training of this, and then to what extent they were dependent on intermediaries and for knowledge of terrain and tactics of evasion and so on? So how did that force work, and how was it trained?
So they by the 19th century they already had kind of a professional training course for border guards in which the officers were professionals in that. So the solution prior to the mid-19th century was they were still using Cossack deployments as border guards in a lot of areas. And then in the beginning decades of the 19th century, they moved away from Cossack units patrolling the border and in various places. So there were even Cossack units along the Polish border. They move away from that in the 19th century towards a kind of professionalized border officer corps and recruits from the military, so as a division of the military. And so there is as so much is happening in the 19th century, a kind of professionalization and scientific approach. So these are military officers who tend to specialize in border control. And many of those same officers are either still in place or the people they trained are still in place in the early Soviet era. So I see a little more continuity than they're just, instead of looking let's say they turn their government gaze in a different direction. So the using the border as an infiltration point against alien ideology was there in Tsarist border patrol of the 19th century. It's just who you're looking for is different. And so obviously they're confronting many areas where the population on two sides of the border is the same. And how do you cultivate local knowledge? So there is an espionage element that goes into that. But as kind of paid informants, as kind of plants, so there is an espionage element that they start to use. Are they successful? I think they're successful in stopping large flows. Obviously, night is the friend of smugglers until spotlights are invented. And after World War I, night is day because you have spotlights. And so they again flipped the equation by creating a technologically infrastructured border. So if before slipping across the border by dead of night was an option open to almost anyone who was ambitious enough or bold enough, by the 20th century, the dynamic has changed, and they're thinking of the technologically. I would see the Iron Curtain as not just the barrier, but the technologically equipped border. So they learned from World War I that if you put barrier, electricity, and signaling together, you can stop the flow even more effectively than ever before. And so we get 85%, 90% ability to control only when you put barrier, signalization, and surveillance together. And all those things come together in the Soviet period.
Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Anybody else? Any further questions? All right.
All right. Very good. Just a quick comment on the changing. You know, if you were a border guard in the 1890s, you were looking for clandestine copies of Marx. If you were a border guard in the 1960s, you were looking for copies of Playboy. What you do is the same. What you're looking for changes.
Very good.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. I appreciate it. When one of you gets a big grant for the big survey of global borders, keep me in mind for the Russian chapter.
Excellent. And also just for everybody, so in 2 weeks, the next session will take place with Professor Lutkov, who will talk about viral sovereignty. So we're getting back a bit more explicitly to the Corona story, but like in respect to also science and history of science. And so we're talking about viral sovereignty in 2 weeks.
The role also of WHO and how MERS and SARS experiences shaped how states responded within and beyond borders.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day, everybody.
You too.